I like your vest
Thanks.
and your shirt, man, and your background. We got a lot of good things going on here.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like modern versus 60s or meets 60s, I guess. So, might as well.
Yeah. Well, how you been doing, man? It's super good to see you. We've not been able to really do a podcast because of the lockdown and
Yeah,
yeah.
COVID.
Yeah, crazy times, but we are doing one now. So like this has been like if we were talking silver linings, I've done a lot of podcasts like this.
Right.
Maybe more than I like Mitch Lerner, the guy who we've talked about, who's the expert on the Puebla incident.
Hmm.
I got the podcast with him, just like we're doing now. It was awesome.
Right. I haven't watched that yet. I know you sent me the link to it, but I haven't got around to seeing it. It's like an hour, right? It's not.
It's not very long. Yeah, it's about an
Yeah.
hour.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to have him on again because his daughter works for CNN, right? And she got pepper sprayed like 3 times during covering the protest in Columbus, right?
Wow.
So yeah.
That's pretty intense.
Well, and then a separate time got her car towed off when she was down there covering it, and just real intense situations out there, which
Right.
we can maybe provide some commentary for the audience through our just a little bit of back and forth, because we're picking up where we left off on the 1968 stuff. We plan to do this Casualties episode.
Right. Which has now been, that was like two months ago,
Oh,
something.
at least like we're talking about it early March, I believe.
Yeah,
And
we were going to try to fit it in sort of before the Martin Luther King Jr. assassination anniversary thing in order to kind of tie into this, because that's one of the things we're going to talk about, of course, because that is a significant casualty of 1968. So,
well, and you pointed out we're just a couple of days on the other side of the assassination of RFK,
right,
uh,
yeah, that's correct.
which would which be another high profile casualty. But that's going to be kind of our theme. And one thing that I think really parallels would be the protests, right?
Right,
Like the response to and how some of the issues are the same, right? With the police violence, with
right,
against peaceful protesters, also against I need to research this more, but about what groups had infiltrated the protests in 68. That's what I was kind of reading into earlier, and just
mhm,
couldn't find anything super valid to kind of riff on. But it's just like anything with researching this and talking about it, it's going to send us down some rabbit holes. So
right, yeah. That's thanks for the internet for that. That's you know.
yeah. Well, so kind of starting off, like we'll just kind of kick off. I know we've talked about Tet, we've talked about Pueblo,
Right.
but one thing that I think really dissuaded a lot of hearts and minds on the Tet offensive was the amount even though you could say it was low in comparison to the number of North Vietnamese that were killed. Americans had 543 killed, which was a high number. So that was something that I read into is very negatively received by the
Right.
American public. And then you had 2,547 wounded, and these stats came out in February, right?
Yeah, right. Relatively early in the year. So, right, that's
Mm-hmm.
going to have some great effect. Well, 1968 overall in Vietnam is a very terrible year for casualties, right? You almost have, well, at this point, you have nearly 500,000, actually over 500,000 troops that are in Vietnam fighting at that time I think the number is close to like maybe 550,000, something along those lines at that point. And this is even when 68, 69, when the military starts to cut back on the amount of people that they're sending out there too. But regardless of that, by the end of 68, you have almost roughly about 80,000 casualties at this point. You have 16 to 17,000 killed, and then you have 70,000 who are wounded. And that's not even adding in all of the massacre stuff that's going on at this time, or the fragging incidents that are happening at this time, and as well as just the psychological damage and the drug abuse thing that's going on too during that time. So it's a very tumultuous time that's not just happening in Vietnam, but I mean, it's also happening over here as well. I mean, there's great civil unrest, there's protests, there's all these different things going on. But Vietnam in 68 with the casualties things is just, I think it's really interesting that you have this amount of people there, and you have, like I said, like 80,000 casualties out of this 500, almost 600,000 soldiers who are active and participating in the Vietnam conflict there. So, I mean, that is a pretty staggering statistic if you think about it, right?
Yeah, and I think it's really good to look at it by year like that, because if we look at it by month, it seems to kind of minimize it, right? Like TET numbers versus what you just said, and what, like, you get 68 with the number killed, almost 17,000, I think is like 1,600 or 16,809, right? But like, you start extrapolating out further on those stats, and that's a great comparison on the troops on the ground there. I'd read that, but I just hadn't connected the dots on it. But that's a high number.
Right, it is. And yeah, I mean, proportionately, yeah, it's almost like if you go over there, right, you have a very high percentage that you're going to be wounded or killed, you know, in some fashion. Something is going to happen to you that is not good.
Well, okay, so while we're on that, and this is way more of a narrative today, and one thing that I that is not so much a narrative today in law enforcement, but in veterans for sure, is you mentioned a minute ago, like psychological, but like the traumatic experiences that these people come back home with, or that the people that are still boots on the ground that have been traumatized and are not receiving any treatment, and they're still out there engaging with not just the enemy, but also peaceful villagers as well in North and South Vietnam. So that seems to be another serious issue, like if you get into My Lai, right?
Yeah.
Charlie Company was, you could say, this always comes up anytime I listen to a podcast or read about this, that Charlie Company, they had experienced like 28 killed or injured, right? So they had like some psychological toll on them, because everybody had kind of knew somebody that had been killed or booby trapped or maimed. And that leads to My Lai, in which let's see what everybody kind of always like, well, it was villagers, there were no Viet Cong, it was men, women, and children, the elderly. But check this out: 173 children, 56 of which were infants, are killed in My Lai. 182 women, 17 of which were pregnant. Right. So the and imagine the psychological toll on people that were there that did not want to participate in that massacre, because those groups did exist. Right. And then there's the people that have been sent over the edge that perhaps were so damaged by what they had seen and been through and were experiencing through the war, that they perhaps committed those atrocities. So, like, mental health, like the officer who has been at the forefront of this whole George Floyd thing. It's like, no one, I haven't heard anybody. I mean, yes, everything's kind of very heated on race right now, and I've been providing some commentary on that, but it's like, well, one thing a psychologist friend of mine pointed out is like, no one is talking about mental health of law enforcement at all on a national level right now.
Right.
And it takes us a long time to start talking about that for vets.
Yeah, right. I think you're absolutely right with that. But I mean, it's almost always been this perceived thing of weakness, right? In terms of like sort of this American macho image or whatever. You know, you're not supposed to have these sort of feelings or whatever. You know, or humane feelings. You know, we're supposed to experience things like this if we have a conscience, right? It's almost like there's a sense of denial with it. In terms of the military thing, and yeah, the massacre stuff really brings that into focus, like with that. Yeah,
I kind of think that maybe, like, I've been thinking about that as like what people would call brainwashing, right?
Yeah.
But not somewhat in the literal sense, but like a numbing down of your conscious, just how you would respond in a situation that didn't require you to respond aggressively, or
right.
you know, and then you take like boots on the ground in the war, it just amplifies. Like, so if we're seeing it, you know, and a lot of police beatings in 1968 of peaceful protesters, university, I mean, it's, so you see some parallels there, but I still haven't seen that be a narrative. And it seems with the warrior types in our culture, that may be like what you said, it would elicit this air of weakness amongst their peers, and that's unfortunate.
Right. Well, like with sort of what's going on with the sort of the protests now, and with police brutality and all that, I think an interesting point that I've heard that's been raised is that police are sort of geared toward being warriors instead of being protectors, and that has somewhat influenced sort of how they interact with say, I mean, not just all people, but unfortunately with people of color or of different race, and they're more geared toward being sort of over militarized, sort of testosterone driven right. Instead of being trained in order to protect your community and protect the people in your community regardless of who they are, you know. So
I was joking around with a cop buddy of mine, and I was like, you guys need to stop being out there trying to catch us and doing something wrong, you know, and like be there when we need you. Patrol, yes, but
right.
I mean, they're very much like my whole life driving, and I'm not a big lawbreaker, man, but like anytime I'm in a vehicle and I see a cop car, I'm like, oh my God, oh, well, how fast am I going?
Right. I know. Do the same thing.
And is that what we want from that? Or like, oh, hey, there's a cop. He could help me if I needed it. Like, I've had to approach a couple of cops to just ask for directions. And I was super nervous about that. Like, one time I was in Dallas and we were lost, and it was night. It was like 2 a.m. and there was a cop sitting right there, and there's all this construction. And I like walked up with my hands where I was like, hey, officer, I'm lost. This my hotel, it's around here somewhere. But I just, and maybe that's just my nervousness, you know, but it's like I don't think so. Like it's seems to be that's the result of some of the prolonged things like what you're talking about. I mean, when I was just a kid is when Rodney King beatings happened, right?
Right. Yeah.
And I was too young to know what was going on with that.
Right.
But I wasn't too young to know that these cops beat this dude up. It's like one of my first, I was like 4 years old or something, right? It's like, oh, what's going on the TV with that?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Even as a child, you recognize that, there's something obviously wrong here. Mm-hmm. That's not right. But we don't look in a way, we don't look to police as guardians or as protectors. They're kind of like they're unfortunately their own sort of military force in a way.
Yeah.
It's really unfortunate. And, you know, I mean, like, we can talk about making that move toward where they're more in this sort of, yeah, we'll help you out when you need us type thing. But their reputation definitely precedes them for the opposite of that.
Well, I just hope that out of this comes some great dialogue for potential ways that things could change for the positive, right?
Right. Yeah. No. Right. I absolutely agree with that. And I just think it's wild that we're talking about sort of this casualty thing, and, you know, going into these different things that are happening in 1968, and how much it actually, in a way, parallels sort of what's happening today to what was happening then. And it's interesting to me that it makes more sense to talk about it in 2020 than it would have, say, 50 years later, like 2 years ago. 50, like in 2018, you know, hey, it's 50 years since 1968. Let's talk about that. But it's actually more relevant now in 2020 than it was in 2018. You know?
True, man.
I just think that's really, really fascinating. It's really interesting how everything's just exploded. And it's also, I mean, we're in the midst of the upcoming presidential election, like they were in '68, right? And that's kind of fueling all this stuff going on. And you got the media involved, and you got all these different factors into it. But it's just the most appropriate time to be talking about 1968 right now. And it's sort of like in the text message that you sent me, you're like, you know, we got to get out there and we got to tell people about this because they're not going to know about it. And I think you're absolutely right in that regard, that, yeah, that this needs to be talked about right now, and that there maybe is something that we can take away from this as historians and as people. So
totally agreed, man. And not just yourself either. Every historian that I've talked with about what's going on, because I mean, quite literally this whole since the killing of George Floyd,
right,
like, it's just like the lockdown plus this, and then these riots in hundreds of cities. Like, it hasn't been like this in my lifetime, for sure. I'm 33 years old, but I can't compare this to anything. So then I start reaching out to historians like Woods and people that are older than me, and I'm like, hey, what's going on here? What have you seen anything like this? What would you compare this to? Because I'm comparing it to 1968, you know.
Right.
And that's what everybody kind of was. Is like, look, there's years that have changed America greatly. 1968 is one, and we're starting to see that 2020 is going to be a year that is I almost want to say, like, the real casualty for me. And I was going to save this to the end, right? It was like,
well, I mean, you can always reiterate that point, you know. I mean, if it's important, which I have no doubt it is. Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely. Because, like, I mean, I have things that, like, we tend to think of casualties as just as people or as great leaders and things like that. But perhaps what's most important here is the casualties in 1968 are essentially the ideas that the 60s were founded on, right? Yes.
Like hearts and minds.
Yeah, right.
Right. I mean, and man, that is for me, like, the faith in our process and living up to America's highest ideals. Yeah. Right. Like you just look around at both these, like, years, and it's like, we seem so far away from that, right? Of being able to, whether we're striving to achieve it or not, or whether it's in the narrative, it just seems like a little further away at this period, at a point of time, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. Like, you mentioned that, you know, is there a moment that's like comparable to this in our lifetime that we can remember? And perhaps the closest thing is September 11th, 2001, right? But even then, it didn't feel like this, like, hopelessness, I would say. It felt like people actually banded together and, hey, we're going to change things, you know, or we're going to we're going to band together. But now it's just like the fabric is just continually unwinding. Everything is continually falling apart, right? And it's just like, you have this feeling that maybe it's just going to get worse from this point. And in a way, that's kind of the 68 thing. It's spiraling out of control at this point. And that's kind of where we are right now, where it's the death of the dream, right?
Yeah, yes.
Because you always say that about 68. It's the year that the dream died. But what necessarily is that dream? And I guess one of the points that I wanted to make is did this dream really die, or did it just taper off? Did it just go into some slumber? And maybe now at this moment, it is being awakened again. We're coming back to this idea, these promises that should have been fulfilled in the 60s. And maybe now is the time that we need to possibly, fulfill those ideas that we have just sort of put on the back burner for the past 50 some odd years.
Yeah, it's very much, I think, taking some steps back to take some steps forward. You know, that sort of metaphor with what's going on. And, you know, like, let's talk about this parallel as we kind of get into the discussion about King. Is look how much, man, this has become a new wave of the civil rights movement.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Like with what's going on now. And that is, I have often also compared the time that we're living in right now to a third Red Scare.
Okay. Yeah. No.
Right.
Right.
But, you know, that's kind of, that could be another talk in and of itself. But this issue with the death of George Floyd leading to this hundreds of cities with having protests, which are, you know, going to drive forward this narrative and hopefully produce some positive results in all, and not just in, like we're talking about, law enforcement, but in racial relations. Right. That is where we need to see improvements. I feel like there's very much this idea that when we talk about Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, that had been achieved.
Right.
That it's done. And we're seeing very much so right now this year that it is not done. We have a ways to go, that we're maybe a couple of generations away.
Yeah. I think that is a fantastic point. And that is one of the things that I wanted to focus on in this, is that a lot of people tend to look back on sort of the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as sort of the end of the civil rights movement. That's sort of like when it stops, and that pretty much everything had been achieved prior to that with, say, the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65, that you have this legislation, and after that, everything is just peachy, right? Like everything is, it's going to work out, hey, everything's good. But that once Dr. King is shot and killed in Memphis in April of 68, that is like sort of the end of the classic civil rights movement. And we've seen historians argue often about where does the civil rights movement begin, but there's always sort of this agreement that, oh, okay, well, it ends whenever Dr. King dies. But the truth of the matter is that the civil rights movement never did end. It just sort of flickered out. It was there, but it just sort of devolved into chaos at this point, and that it has just sort of been an unfulfilled promise since that time. And that maybe now in 2020, we are seeing where we might have the possibility to fulfill that promise again.
Promise of the promised land, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's man, I listened to that speech today.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you another super powerful one that is the eulogy of RFK, right? That is, both of those speeches are just so powerful. But it's just like, you know, like what he's talking about, it's like, that is has that been achieved? I would say no. Right. Like, so, and I would say, and I think that's what we are saying is that we still have a ways to go. But what, you know, we need to still be asking the question is like, what can we do to bring about that achievement as a society? Like, I mean, I've been listening to all of these different speeches from RFK's, either like when he's running or before. And it's so crazy. Like when he starts to interject commentary on civil rights, how like, have you seen that one where he's talking to that sheriff and he's like, "Hey, why'd you arrest these people?"
Yeah.
And he's like, "They were peaceful protesters." He's like, "Well, somebody told me they were going to riot, so I arrested them." He's like, "But they didn't break the law." And he's like, "But they were going to." And he goes, "But they did, but you can't." He's like, "Okay, well, on the lunch break, I'm going to need you to read the Constitution because you can't do that." Like,
Right.
I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but not heavily.
Right.
But just the questions that we were asking at that time, like this is a real question. And I believe this was, it was either RFK or when JFK first started talking about it. It's when we started to interject the morals into it. It's like, do all Americans deserve this, or just the white ones? Like literally, like we were asking that question on a national stage in politics,
right,
in the early 60s.
Yeah, way back. Yeah, way
when
back.
my parents and your parents were alive.
Yeah, and that's still a question that we're still asking ourselves today. That we haven't provided a. Well, I think there is a valid answer to that question, and that's that all Americans are not treated equally, unfortunately, right? But that we, especially now, we see that. But that question sort of, it's almost like it wants to be avoided. Like people don't want to face that they kind of just want
to. What I just keep telling people is, look, this is not comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. It's not comfortable for you to know the history of Emmett Till. It's not comfortable for you to know that we put up a monument for that boy in 2008 and somebody shot it 317 times.
Right.
It's not comfortable to know that stuff's still going on, and that there's a prominent lawyer in Harrison, Arkansas that is entrenched in the Klan and is very, very racist. But yet we have peaceful protest happening in Harrison, Arkansas. So that's great.
Yeah, right.
But it's very much so not comfortable to learn the history of slavery, of civil rights movement, the whole narrative for 400 years. It's not. I've cried many times recently because it's like, oh man, I'm gonna go back through it. I'm gonna consume all the material I can so I can hopefully increase my empathy level a little bit, or be able to, like, there's this guy Daryl Davis who gets Klan members. He's a black man, and he's a musician, but he befriends older racist white men, and then they're like Klan members. Oftentimes, gets them to leave the Klan. Like that's like somebody being like, "Oh, hey, you're completely broke and homeless. Here's $2,000." Like, like just totally like restore your faith in humanity type stuff. Like, so that tells me right there that we can educate some people. But here's the thing. It's like, are we going to be able to do that within our own racial lines? Because he's a black man educating white people, and they're seeing that he is like you and I. Right. That there is not these lies that they've been told that doesn't hold up. And it's like, that is, I know that probably you say the same thing, man. It wasn't until I went to college and learned this history that we're talking about did I get vested. I mean, man, how many black people were from our town? A few, but I like, it was like, 4 or 5 in my grade vicinity, right? Like within my grade or a grade under me or grade below me in high school. So it's like, we didn't grow up around it, and not on enough of a scale to see and know. And I sure didn't learn the history in high school to be able to empathize, and only through my education that empathy has come. And it's my hope that people listening to this podcast, people do their research, people pay attention to what's going on, can empathize with not just African Americans, but gay people.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, women. Like
Yes, right.
systematically
Right.
disenfranchised
Yeah.
Native Americans.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I completely agree with that. And you're right about the empathy thing. I mean, I was always sort of interested in the civil rights thing and all that, but it's like, to me, it really didn't hit. And you were talking about this, like you texted me and you're like, hey, I'm watching Eyes on the Prize here, right? Which was a documentary that was made like in 1986, 1987.
Good.
And that is an exceptional documentary. If you want to experience sort of like to empathize with it, that is a good tool. I mean, it's all primary sources. You see the footage of these unfortunate people being beaten and just, you know, discriminated against, and it's like, why? You know, it just doesn't and it's both empowering, but it's also like but yeah, it really is, it's emotional. It's very emotional. And that to me is sort of what really got me onto this, saying, okay, this is extremely vital. It's extremely important. This isn't just some event that occurred in the 60s. It's something that we have to be concerned about today and always. We always have to keep these principles in mind, that we're all equal, man. We're all in this together, you know, and that racial inequality has no room now.
And that would ever be a controversial idea. Like we can't.
You're right. How can people oppose this? You know.
Well, and we can't. You know, and a whole lot of people are just sitting around shaking their heads, just being like, "Well, that's a very small percentage," or "I don't know anybody that's racist," or I don't discriminate against black people." But to say all those things in my mind is to diminish what you don't know, right? Like what people you don't know are going through. It's like, just because I've just been telling everybody, look, it's not true for you. I get it. It's not true for you, but it's true. Okay. Let's go over here and look at this example from history. Let's fast forward to how it's still going on.
Yeah.
Man, in our time, would you believe that? That sucks. Do you need 150 more examples? Because I got them. You know, but it's just like, and I just tried to stay like there would even be a controversial idea to argue for racial equality. And then people argue that it doesn't exist, or like some guy was like, well, you know, I get discriminated against, called a redneck. And I'm just like, dude, you could change everything about that if you wanted. Like, you could dress different and talk different. Like, I mean, whatever. And I was like, I don't think that this whole class of people is just talking shit about you. I was like, but if they were, that's all stuff you can change. You can't.
Yes.
You can't change it. Like Cora turned me on this the other day. There was it was like a TED talk or something. It was this lady asked, it was an all white audience, and she was like, who here would trade places with a black person in society? Stand up. No one stood up. You know, like, and she was trying to illustrate that it's like, okay, so see, you do know.
Right. On some subconscious level, right, that there is this, you do know that there is an inequality, right?
Yeah, and this is another one that I've heard, like, basically, you know, our parents never had to have the talk with us about, like, because, you know, think about somebody our age's mom, what their parents went through. So the stories that they're going to tell their kid, and how, you know, it's like, those are conversations that they don't happen for, you know, our in our households. And
right.
That is, that's something that someone pointed out that I know. And I was just like, oh man. She's like, yeah, my mom had to talk with me about how, if I get arrested or about these other incidents that happened to people we knew, or this history that occurred that had happened to my grandpa or my dad. And it's just like, oh man, like I'd never even I mean, yeah, you know, but you only through talking with your neighbor, man, and researching and watching Eyes on the Prize and having a conversation with your friend who's also researching, you know, things I don't. Right. Man, I'm so jealous you got to take a graduate course in civil rights, bro.
Man, it was mind blowing. I mean, it was great. Like I recommend. I hope they bring it back. I mean, it was an exceptional course.
Was it on rotation, like every 2 years or something?
I mean, I don't know. That was Dr. Moses that did that, and that was an exceptional course. And yeah, I mean, I learned a lot from that about the movement and about sort of its place. And yeah, this idea that sort of where does the civil rights movement begin and where does it end? And it's sort of like I've said before. I don't think it has ended. I think we have just sort of placed it out of our minds, and that we have these fire ups that come up that bring these ideas back, but that the central core ideas of the civil rights movement have still not been achieved. It's not just some period in history. Oh, been there, done that. But that it's relevant today, and that it's not just a historical issue. I mean, it's a historical issue and an ethical issue, but it's something that tells us not only about our history but about our humanity. And I think that's vital. That's absolutely vital.
So here's something I've been thinking about. Like the second episode of Eyes on the Prize about Little Rock Nine, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I know that you've talked about like maybe a planned episode for an Arkansas episode on that, right?
Right. Yeah, we were going to talk about maybe Orville Falbus and sort of his production.
Right. But so maybe I think for a lot of Arkansans, since we, integrated in the late 50s, 3 years after the Supreme Court decision, I would like to point out, that maybe that things ended there. But very much so they did not. Like, right. I mean, the disenfranchisement goes on, and it's like that is why it's so vitally important to like keep going through that, whether it's Eyes on the Prize or just that history post your state. Like for us being in Arkansas, it's like, yeah, okay, cool, we're integrated. The movement's not over. You fast forward to 68 when Martin Luther King's assassinated. Right. It's very and the things that are going on in 68 in terms of protest and before, I mean, it was Robert Kennedy seeing them brutalized that upped his investment in the movement.
Right.
Like one of his staff got beaten as well, if I'm not mistaken, and on the freedom rides, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, man. That was the early 60s, the freedom rides.
Yeah. But that's when I believe when RFK first started getting invested. Right. So here's another thing I wanted to ask you about, just while we're on it, right? So you have RFK getting morally vested. You have I think too, I never really got into this either, but how interesting it is the Kennedy brothers, is him as Attorney General, how much they were working as a team together, right?
Yeah.
That's something that I would like to explore a little more. But okay, so JFK, his civil rights dialogue doesn't have a lot of, mobility to it. He gets assassinated. LBJ breathes some life into it, but still fast forward to 68. It's not where it should be. RFK is kind of running on that platform. He's got a track record of like, hey, yeah, I became more empathetic. I changed, like I was watching this interview of him going to some like poor neighborhoods and being like, if I came out of these neighborhoods, I would have been a juvenile delinquent or a revolutionary. But he didn't. He came out of a super privileged household, was LBJ just called him like a snot-nosed little brat or something like that, right? But LBJ gets these civil rights movements passed while he's sitting in the White House talking to George Wallace about the most atrocious things ever, honestly. Like the LBJ tapes on that are just disgusting, right?
Yes, yeah.
And LBJ's quotes, Mitch Lerner shared this the other day. He's like, well, I've taken the black man from a D+ to a C-. And it's like, but so that is an interesting thing that I'd never like really paralleled, is that LBJ got some things passed, but fast forward to when he's stepping down or not running for re-election, it's like how much has he really achieved?
Right. Well, and if you think about it too, right, it's the pieces of legislation that LBJ is remembered for, which are the Civil Rights Acts, were passed in 64 and 65, but LBJ still sat in office for another 3 years after that, right? And what is essentially happening in those 3 years between the passing of the legislature and when he leaves office? This is when you have Watts in 65. You have the Long Hot Summer, right, where you have like 150 plus race riots break out in the inner cities of America, during this time. The Black Panthers appear at this time. Black nationalism, right? So it's like, I don't know if it's like he just felt that I passed the legislature, we're done, and maybe that is like that way with a lot of people. I think when you put a law into being, people just automatically assume, oh, it's the law, it must be followed at this point. But of course, we know that's not true. People have to have an ethical transformation, a change. It's not just a sheet of paper that makes it so. People have to change.
Yeah. And then goes into the age-old question, how do you win over hearts and minds?
Yeah, right. Which is the Vietnam problem, right? I mean, you got that going on too. How do we solve this problem? But then you have this bigger problem going on back home too. Yeah, the fight for the hearts and minds of people and that ultimately becomes the greatest casualty probably of the 68 thing, right? Is the dream.
So April 4th, so Memphis. I would like to go maybe one day if you have some time, anytime in the future. I would love to go up and get some footage and maybe do some sort of docu episode from Memphis, maybe a follow-up MLK episode or something. I go to Memphis, not like super regular, but a few times a year or two. But I think it'd be cool to get some footage. I know you've been to Dealey Plaza, right?
Yeah, Dallas.
Yeah. So, but I think that would be super cool to run up there since we're so close. I mean, we're 3.5 hours.
Yeah, right. It's not that far. So.
But so King assassinated on his balcony by James Earl Ray.
Right.
And that sparks a bunch of protesting, rioting, violence.
Yeah, I think that kind of gets forgotten too, right? Is that there was this immense outpouring, this public response that, right, you have this rioting that occurs in these major cities, and which leads to that great moment with RFK, where he steps out and tries to, stop the mob and say, hey, my brother was killed by a white man too. It's like, so I kind of know where y'all are coming from here, but you need to kind of stop it or whatever. But I mean, that's a great moment for him, and it shows, right, his empathy with minorities, right, that there was this massive outpouring, this outcry whenever King was killed. I think kind of in the history books, if you like read it, say in high school or whatever, it's just like, well, he died and that was pretty much it, right? But that's not it, right? You get the rioting, but then eventually you get Congress who passed the Civil Rights 68 Act, which has to do with the housing authority stuff. So it's like they're being spurned into motion by this outpouring of different emotions over Dr. King's death and over the civil rights movement. But I mean, right, and it's not just technically about King's death, even though he's viewed as the figurehead sort of the movement, but it's sort of like, yeah, where is the movement now? Where are we now? That sort of thing.
One thing I was reading that blew my mind about this, that like I knew there were protests and riots, mostly because of the story that you just mentioned with RFK.
Mm-hmm.
But thousands of National Guard, regular Army, Marines were all deployed
right.
to deal with riots in hundreds of cities. And that's when you definitely do see violence against peaceful protesters from police and otherwise, but parallel to today. 39 dead, 2,600 2,600 injured, and then 21,000 arrested across the country. Yeah. I think are the stats on that. But that is, I didn't know it was on the scale it was with the
Right.
use of military force.
Right. Well, the National Guard apparently had their hands very busy in the late 60s, you know, with everything that's going on. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of it's kind of just skirted over. Maybe you get like a sentence that's like, hey, there were some protests, but right, you don't really go to this. I mean, where it's like practically martial law on the streets. I mean, people were very, very upset and rightfully so.
Okay, so here's another parallel that like it's kind of a contextual thing. I've been trying to wrap my mind around and do some research around Nixon's Southern strategy, but
Mhm.
that's again another talk, which I would love to do a talk with you on about that, because that's him bringing in, like Woods and I were talking about this today, bringing in the Southern Democrats and getting, you get sort of this transference of like the racist agenda along party lines, sort of swapping, if that makes sense,
Right.
right? Because I don't really think about my racist liberal friends. You know what I'm saying? It's opposite.
Right. I understand. Yeah.
But so with Nixon, when these riots are coming on, right, when this is all happening, that's when Nixon reinterjects into the conversation, not necessarily for the first time, but he basically says that he is going to save the country of all of this domestic violence, right? So he
Okay.
starts kind of being like, oh, I got a plan for this. All right. So,
Yep.
but you go back on the hearts and minds thesis we keep hammering on. Think about the faith in our democratic process that was eroded because of this stuff that happened in 68, cause and effect. You get LBJ stepping down, Nixon wins re-election, ends up stepping down because of Watergate. So
Right.
it's like, that is just again a cause and effect for me. That's like, oh man, like that is inherently connected, you know, on an interesting level.
Right. No, no, yeah, I think that's a good point. But yeah, it is definitely a cause and effect thing. I mean, there's a lot that's happened. Yeah, I mean, MLK dies, right? And he's killed by James Earl Ray, which I mean, that's sort of an interesting story because I mean, it takes them, I think, well over a month before they catch him, and eventually he confesses to the crime. But then he recants his statement because he believes that he's going to be pardoned at some point because of what he did or whatever. I don't know, but like it's just and then the RFK thing where you get him where he's the Democratic. He wins the primary right in California at that time, and then he's shot by Sirhan in the basement kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel right in Los Angeles. And it's just like you get the conspiracy thinking there at some point, right? About like, okay, well, did James Earl Ray act alone? Was he part of a larger conspiracy? Was this somehow connected to the CIA, which is something that he would later claim, right? Or Sirhan, was he brainwashed? You know, so it's like it's not just. I mean, there's a lot of doubt. There's just a lot of doubt that's generating, and it's eroding away at sort of people's belief in the government. And you get the resurgence too in the theories about the JFK assassination during this time period, because you have the trial of Clay Shaw in New Orleans by District Attorney Jim Garrison, which is in the headlines all over the place. You know, hey, Kennedy was killed by CIA, FBI, military-industrial complex. This was all that caused Vietnam, you know, all that. So it's like you have different points that are breaking the columns of the institutions that sort of the country is built on. And it's just creating a lot of doubt.
Watch our previous episode with Thurman's first appearance on the podcast for more info on those trials. or you can access, I know you can mine, but can't you access your master's thesis online?
Yeah. Yeah, okay. It's online.
Fantastic. Yeah. But yeah, definitely listeners, check that out if you want more info. Listen to the podcast and read the thesis. Yeah, that's a great point, man. That is something I was reading into the Sirhan case a little bit, and with the jockeying of the guilty, not guilty, how things, because if I'm not mistaken, first it was like he was asking for death. Then they're wanting to check, like they're okay, we're gonna get it to lie. It was just a circus, man. Like
Right.
what I was reading, I was like, man, and this, and then on top of that, you've got the whole Manchurian Candidate,
Right. Yeah, that he was like
larger
yeah.
conspiracies. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that he was somehow brainwashed or programmed in order to shoot and kill RFK or whatever. And
What narrative on that do you go with? That he was upset about like the 6 Day War and like him having some nationalistic leanings with the war in the Middle East? Like, is
I
that?
mean, yeah, like the RFK thing is something that I haven't really delved into that far. But as far as is that, yeah, I mean, that could be the most likely explanation for that. I don't think it was a conspiracy. I don't think that there were multiple shooters. I know that there's also this theory out there that it was like a friendly fire situation, that maybe one of the Secret Service agents in trying to shoot Sirhan accidentally shot Robert Kennedy. You know, that sort of
Well, what,
thing.
5 other people were shot, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, right. You're right. There were other people who were wounded in that shooting, and but like the conspiracy thinking type idea or whatever. Also, the MLK thing. I bet it was just James Earl Ray acting alone. You know, even though later you get this sort of convoluted CIA plot that Ray was working for a guy named Raoul who had some CIA connections, and hey, I want you to buy this gun and place it in this hotel, you know, at this time point, which I think was sort of the theory that they were throwing out there. But that that part of the reason why Ray reversed his confession was that he wanted to avoid the death penalty, even though that was at that time ruled unconstitutional. They didn't know that, but that it sort of like inadvertently leads to these conspiracy sort of claims. And you also get some of the researchers from the JFK thing are also involved in the MLK thing, being like, well, there was a second shooter over here, you know, it's like,
Yeah.
it gets pretty complicated.
Well, you know, the CIA, you've mentioned them a couple of times. I was reading about them infiltrating into the protests, and that would be something I'm definitely going to read up more on it. I just need you know, Woods had given me a book suggestion here, and I purchased it in my Audible, but I need to go ask him some good sources for just like spy stuff for 1968, because you read so much about CIA involvement that it would be, I think, a good, let's see. Okay. The Search for the Manchurian Candidate by John Marks. The CIA and Mind Control, The Secret History of the Behavioral Sciences. Because I was asking Woods, I was like, hey, what do you think about this Charles Manson book about the CIA and stuff? He was like, he had a pretty good opinion on it. I listened to it and I regret doing it. It was just, it didn't do anything. He asked a lot of really cool questions, but he totally lost me when he started trying to answer them. Right. But he said to take a look at this one, and this is half the length too. So I'm looking forward to listening to that as soon as I finish the one I'm on. But that is something, the CIA in 68, that could be a good follow-up episode for us to tackle. Maybe we need to do an episode with like me, you, and Woods. He's coming on.
I mean, I'm down with that. Well, I mean, 68 is important too, because you have the MK Ultra experiments that are going on at this point with the, you know, the mind control and the psychedelic drugs. And of course you get the rise of the counterculture during this time period. And of course, you get people who are like, well, hey, we're the CIA somehow involved in that, you know, and right, like with the Manson. Like, one of the interesting things is like, hey, maybe the CIA were behind the People's Temple with Jim Jones, and later, like, the Jonestown Massacre. I mean, it gets wild, you know?
Yeah, but, like, just like they're experimenting, social experiments.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Well, you know, one of the most interesting people in not condoning or coming down on any sides, but people spinning these coronavirus conspiracies.
Oh yeah.
Like, you know, somebody said that goes, "This is an experiment to see how fast they can bring us under control," which
Yeah.
is apparently pretty damn fast. And I was like, "Oh, that's kind of
Yeah.
funny," you know.
Yeah.
But you know, I mean, but think like that has gone on in this time period that
Mhm.
we're referencing back to, and perhaps it's always going on some level about you know, how do you control crowds? Like, I
Yeah.
mean, you've got to be able to control chaotic situations, but it's like, how do you derive that without having a crowd to control?
Right.
You got to
Yeah.
wait for a historical example. I mean, I'm not saying that we create these situations so we can experiment with controlling a crowd, but it's it is interesting how you would derive the best ways of doing that. And maybe that it's difficult to, and it's been a long time, is why we're seeing so many acts of brutality here against peaceful kneeling protesters or whatever, you know,
Yeah.
standing in neutral areas so they can be protesting. But we are seeing that, and I think that right now is a byproduct of not having the training. I know, not a friend of mine, but a, a really good friend of mine's friend is in the National Guard, and he
Mhm.
got deployed to deal with this, right? And he's like, told my friend, he's like, "Man, we have no clue what we're doing. Like, it's just like
Yeah.
a big confusing thing. The guy that's his commander's like, I don't know what we're doing. Like, we're not prepared for this. We're not ready to deal with this." And it's like, great. Because that's like, then you're going to be violent because you don't know what to do,
Mhm.
would be my assertion. But not being prepared to deal with the stuff going on in 2020, that's a classic case of not learning from our 1968 history.
Right. Right. No, yeah, right, absolutely. You're right. It's just like it's a whole just a recipe for disaster, pretty much. You have right, both sides of this equation have not been in this situation recently or before. So it's like, yeah, nobody really knows what to do. And I mean, that's not just with protesters or with police or National Guard, but that also has to do with our legislature as well, with our government and with just us, the average citizen. How are we supposed to react to this, you know? So I
Yeah.
mean, it's just it's a fascinating time, and it definitely does reflect sort of this era of uncertainty where, you know, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. But I guess the murder hornets are gone now. So
That was just that was a Monster of the Week episode,
yeah,
okay?
right. Yeah, it's like the X Files or Supernatural or whatever, where you have like,
X Files is what I was going for,
yeah,
man.
yeah,
Uh, uh,
right.
so you know, but this is something like, okay, so protest. How long have we been having protests now? It's the 7th. There's another protest in Russellville tonight, and we're a
Okay.
small city, but they
Mhm.
are still happening. I saw Philadelphia yesterday was insane with the number
Yeah.
of people they had, but it's still going on. Been going on for a few weeks now.
Mhm.
What, I guess like 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Going into week 3, if I'm not mistaken. But something to point out with the 68 comparison is that these protests and riots and incidents of violence occurred from the time King was assassinated all the way through the
Right.
Democratic National Convention in
Right.
August.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It was just right, unrelenting. And I mean, if you look historically, I mean, like the years preceding that, you will see how many different disturbances that there are leading up to these points. I mean, the insanity, like I said, of the long hot summer, which was in '67, which you had 150 plus riots break out in these different cities in America, and it's all over racial inequality. However, by '68, you start to see a turning point, and that's when it leads into like the Democratic National Convention, right? Where the protesters, it becomes in a way less, unfortunately, it becomes less about the civil rights thing. The civil rights thing becomes more of an aside to the larger problem of Vietnam, right? People are more pro, hey, we don't need to be over in Vietnam, but we're going to forget about these other people who've been marching and protesting and trying to change the system for 10, 15 years, you know? And to me, I think that, and I think I said it before, is that the civil rights movement is the ultimate casualty of 68, of this time period, because the ideas of that are shelved for the Vietnam War movement. That becomes the in vogue thing. Hey, hell no, we won't go. That sort of thing like that. And the civil rights thing sort of gets buried. It gets forgotten, and that's why we are currently in the state we are, because we went back to sleep.
Yeah, that's very thought-provoking. That could be
and we shouldn't have. That should have been one of the major. And I know this is probably considered like, hey, this is that Monday morning quarterbacking type stuff. Oh, hey, they should have done this or they should have done that. But is that the civil rights movement should have not been just relegated as just another scene to this larger picture of the Vietnam conflict thing. When the civil rights protests, the groups in like King with the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, were some of the first people to be opposed to the Vietnam War. So you can say in a way that a lot of the Vietnam protests actually originates with Black Americans, with the civil rights movement, and a lot of that has to do too because African Americans, Black Americans, were being disproportionately drafted into the army versus whites at this time period.
So Mitch Lerner, that guy I talked with, he's writing a book on this, right? He's writing, I asked him this question. I was like, hey, I've read this and there's a book in my stack. I just haven't got to it. He suggested a book on the podcast for me to read because I was like, what do you know about that? About why these African Americans are being disproportionately drafted into Vietnam? And he explained it briefly, gave me a book suggestion, but that is something else that's going on within the Vietnam War that you're like, oh, that too,
right?
It's like in multiple ways they're being disenfranchised, and by the time of the Democratic National Convention in August, it does seem to be more about the anti-war protests. That's right. What is coming into the national narrative more so, I feel, than civil rights. I know that there's still things happening with civil rights, but
right, yeah. I mean, it's still going on, but it's being sort of eclipsed by this anti-war movement that is gaining traction. And I mean, that goes into with the casualty thing from Vietnam, like we were talking about, like the 80,000 casualties from just the Americans alone from that year. We're talking about psychological damage and all, but we're also talking about the assassinations of these leaders, right? Like Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. And how they're kind of looked back on these as these champions of peace, right? But it's like with Robert Kennedy, it's like I read like a lot of like if I talk to people who lived at that time about Robert Kennedy, it's pretty much they will talk about how Robert Kennedy was gonna take us out of Vietnam or whatever, sort of like this idea that JFK wasn't gonna escalate the Vietnam conflict, that they were opposed to it. But like I think it's important that we remember Robert Kennedy. I mean, not just this like say anti-Vietnam War thing, but right is how he handled and appealed to the different minority groups. It was more of and I think that's kind of forgotten in the wake of this anti-war style movement thing that takes precedence over the civil rights movement.
Yeah. So one thing I was reading into briefly that I don't know a whole lot about, but I'm sure I could read books on it, but the Chicago 7.
Okay.
Have you read much about that or know much about that?
I mean, I've read about it several years ago.
So, well, they tried to charge the organizers of the protest with conspiracy. right? I believe they were all acquitted, if I'm not mistaken. Again, I was just reading this recently, so my memory may not be correct. But I wonder if we're going to see something like that with these 2020 protests. Is basically why I brought that up.
Well, I think. Oh,
go ahead.
I think also, right. What's kind of fascinating is that, like, the anti-war movement, and even like with Dr. King and sort of the things that he's saying before he is fatally shot, with the anti-war Vietnam thing, is that the authorities, say like the FBI or even LBJ, who's really interested and is surveilling, what's going on with these different civil rights groups at this time, sort of attribute this anti-war movement, the ideal of it, as sort of this communist thing. That, hey, it's the communists. They're trying to subvert sort of the American belief that we need to be over there and fighting the good fight, sort of thing. And that you sort of see that now with the protests that are going on, right? You got Donald Trump and you got all these conservative pundits who are like, well, the protesters, they're the Antifa folks, right? They're all these communists, right, who just want to destabilize the government and then bring in their own brand of socialism or whatever, that sort of thing. But you see the parallel here is that you had the FBI and you had LBJ and these other people looking at, say, Dr. King and the different groups and the civil rights movements, and a lot of them are starting to radicalize at this point, like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, like kicks out all the white people, right, at this point, hey, we don't want you involved in this, and they're getting militant, and you got the Black Panthers and all that, but this must be communism. It's not like maybe the system is broken and that's why people are reacting this way. No, it has to be this external threat that is actually creating the discord that people are experiencing. That, like, but it's almost like avoiding what is essentially the real problem here, which is the system itself. It's broken.
Yeah, man. And I know there's a lot going on right now, but at least there's not a Vietnam War. Maybe we can take a couple more steps forward on these issues.
Yeah, okay, that is true, right? There is not that going on yet. Not yet. The year, we're halfway through.
Well, I say that we are, like, this is a sad statistic, man, is we have been in the Middle East now longer than we were in Vietnam.
I know, right? That is something that, like, Terry, my wife, talks to me about a lot because she's a teacher. And, she's like, a lot of the kids I have now were not alive whenever, say, the September 11th terrorist attacks happened. And it's like their whole lives, they've known war. They have not known peace in their time at all. We have constantly been in a state of emergency and a state of war since that time period, since that day. And that, there are kids today growing up, who can be drafted now or not drafted, but who can enlist, right? Who weren't alive at the time that the terrorist attacks happened and that we invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, but that we have been there for nearly 20 years now. And, it's insane. It's
it really is.
Insane.
Yeah, man. So I got a couple of stats here on the Democratic National Convention, right? But so the riots continue, right? The response is similar to the protest, violence, riots, but 650 arrests, 100 were treated in hospitals, 192 police are injured, and 49 of them need medical treatment. But we're seeing, the last time I checked, it was over 400 documented instances of brutality against peaceful protesters caught on video.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a vital point to make with the Chicago Democratic National Convention riots in '68, is that it was highly televised.
On live TV. Now it's
on live
Facebook
television,
Live.
right? And that the discord, or that the issues that were going on didn't just, I mean, it wasn't just in the violence of the protests outside, but the Democratic Party itself were infighting inside the building as well with each other. And then you have this going on outside where you got protesters getting beat up by people who look like their parents or their dad, you know. And it's like, it's a bad situation. It just looks bad on everybody's part at that point. Well, probably besides protesters who are just unfortunately being harassed, you know, due to police brutality. But it's just a bad situation for everybody, man.
It is, man. And I encourage anyone that has not seen footage of the stuff we're talking about. It's out there. Like you can watch it on video. It just like we're seeing now on live feeds from people's phones. Get on YouTube. From anything that we have hit on this episode, people can see that history. They can see. Oh man, was it? When did King do the march? I'm fuzzy on this, so maybe you can. But when did King do the march where all the kids were hit with the water hoses? Do you remember that? They had a ton of kids with them on one of them, and it turned violent. And I want to say, was that Montgomery? No.
Yeah, it may have been, right. But no, I remember this. Yeah.
Let me see. I'll just Google it real quick. Civil rights protest, kids sprayed. But that's the type of stuff, man. Like if I talked about, actually that's way, looks like earlier. It's in Birmingham.
Okay, yeah. That was
earlier 60s, I believe. 63, I believe.
Okay, yeah.
Well, I'm conflating, or not conflating, but some of this stuff is running together for me. So I've been watching early civil rights stuff, like late 50s, early 60s. But then I've also been like immersing in the 67, 68 stuff because of our talks and interest. So,
right.
Anyway. But you know, it's seeing those things on primary video, just of this history that's what made me empathetic. It's like, oh man, I cannot, like, there's so many images from this year that I'm never going to get out of my brain.
Yep.
And we talked about that, I believe, on our last episode, but the media and sort of the imagery and of the Vietnam thing, which of course, 68 is going on when the period we're talking about. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of images again, right, that we're talking about here. We're talking about the protest stuff. I mean, the iconic image of MLK, unfortunately shot just lying on the balcony, right, of I forgot what the name of the hotel was. Right, you got everybody pointing like, hey, you know, and then of course you got RFK, you got him bleeding out, you know, with the gunshot in the back of his head. I mean, it's just, you know, it's bad. The protesters getting beat down in Chicago with the nightsticks and thrown into paddy wagons and dragged through the streets. And the student protest, the students and faculty protests across the country, but interviews with those students after being batoned. And the reporter's like, oh, I see there your face. It's got blood all over it. What happened? He's like, oh, well, this, you know, and they're doing a great job about not getting emotionally inflamed. If I just got beat up by the police, I'm going to be mad about that. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Oh man, and the faculty were commenting on administrators and how that they had sort of invited it in and knew that this would likely be the result because that's what's going on everywhere.
Right.
But the student protests, which really erupted after the King assassination. But again, these protests continue. So it's like that really makes me wonder how far out, like, is this going to keep going? Because man, we're in election year. That's another parallel. Right. So is this going to keep going until November?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. When's it going to end? Right.
Yeah. I mean, because if we're looking back at history and drawing parallels, it's The protests are still happening. Philadelphia being the biggest one I've seen recently that got some coverage last night, but we could be weeks out. If not, I mean, this could be going on in August. Here we are, June, what is it? June 7th, I believe.
Yeah.
2020. Could this be going on August 29th? Like the riots at the DNC?
I think it's kind of interesting, how this does sort of hinge on an election year too. I think one thing we need to keep in mind is remarkably that LBJ is at the helm the entirety of 68, right? I mean, Nixon's elected, but he doesn't go into office until 69. And it's weird to think that Nixon becomes even more reviled, right, than LBJ is in his 2 terms, right, in office. But it's just interesting that 68 is like the turning point year that most historians in sort of this 20th century American thing focus on. The 68 year, you have LBJ who's in charge, but it's yet Nixon becomes the bigger monster, right, than LBJ ever was.
True. Man, I've really been interested in doing some more, like, this is the time period that's going to naturally come next for me, like getting into the Nixon administration.
Yeah.
In my personal interest, because I am fascinated by how he was able to do some of these things, like that Southern strategy. Like I just started talking with Woods about this other day, but I've been reading about it, read some articles about it, and have a book that I read in graduate school that I got back out and brought home, read the introduction. It's a very interesting time where American politics do take a turn, and then you get Nixon coming out, and it's like,
right.
That back to the hearts and minds thing. It's just like further erosion of faith in living up to our highest ideals.
Right. Another interesting point about sort of this presidential thing that's going on, and this ties into the casualty thing too, is if Robert Kennedy had lived, right? There's always this debate, if he had lived, would he have been elected, and would things have been different? And in a way, right, it sort of mirrors his brother, right, John Kennedy, right? If he hadn't been shot and killed in Dallas, would he have been reelected, and would Vietnam never have happened? Or, would the civil unrest of the latter 60s been nowhere near the levels that we had seen, or we actually saw? But would Robert Kennedy have gone on to get the Democratic nomination for president, and would he have won the election against Nixon? I think there's an interesting book that's called Coming Apart that's written by William L. O'Neill, which was published in 1970. So it's like kind of contemporary with what was happening or had happened at that time, but it's looking back at the 60s, right at the edge going into the 70s. And he makes the case that he doesn't believe that Kennedy would have been able to secure the nomination. He says that the next upcoming primary would have shifted back to New York, and that most likely Eugene McCarthy would have won that.
That's a great point.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating, because it's like most people if you talk to, it's like, Robert Kennedy, he would have been president. He would have been the Democratic nominee. He would have beat Nixon, and it would have been a better future or whatever. But that you have other people who will argue against that and say no, that there would have been some resistance to that, and that Kennedy was running on this sort of idealism that didn't have proper footing or whatever. But it's that idealism that we tend to cling on to with the 60s, right? That we tend to hold on to this idea that, hey, we're gonna champion civil rights. We're gonna stop the war in Vietnam. We're gonna win over the hearts and minds of people, right? That sort of thing, and that becomes part of the casualty of 68. That idealism of the 1960s becomes the ultimate casualty, and I mean that ties in with the civil rights movement too, the ideas of the civil rights movement, but that this idealism that we're going to better ourselves, and that we have these high American ideas about freedom and about individuality and about liberty and all this other stuff, but that's the casualty of 68. Yeah. I mean, factor in the body counts from Vietnam, all the people who are messed up psychologically, the drug abuse stuff from that. You got the great leaders thing in there with MLK and with RFK, and then you have the civil rights stuff. But ultimately, right, it's this idealism, this idea of hope and change that is sort of ground out of people at this point. That is sort of, and it's replaced by cynicism. That's what happens, is that you get cynicism that takes the place of that, and that's where you get all these rampant conspiracy theories from. People don't trust the government, but it's all footed in this stuff. It was the perfect storm.
Yeah,
68 is the perfect storm.
Furthering your idea on your thesis points you made there, which I was super inspired by, but like the idea, if you termed it like, okay, everybody now knows what this deep state is that we speak of all the time, it's like,
right.
But really, like the furthering, like you're talking about the conspiracy theories that are coming out of MLK and conspiracy theories that are coming out of RFK,
right?
So that is the further erosion of that faith and those ideas. Right. And think about how our view of the presidency changed during those periods, right? Of like, you have the end of Camelot, then you have LBJ and Nixon,
right?
Like, how many fans of the White House do you have during the middle of the Nixon scandal,
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what's interesting too is that LBJ does get reelected on sort of these principles, or he wins the election in '64 sort of on these principles of, hey, the Great Society, we're going to end poverty, we're not going to escalate the war in Vietnam and all that. And obviously it's the opposite that happens. Everything, but it's that idealism that dies out, and it's replaced by distrust, it's replaced by cynicism. And just this idea that we can't trust our leaders, we can't trust our authorities. I mean, hey, you watch the TV, you see that they're beating people on the street, right, who are peacefully protesting. And here we are in 2020, and we're still sort of asking ourselves these questions, right? It's like, can we trust the government? Are these people really working for us? Why are they beating down peaceful protesters in the streets, And
that's that. Those are all great points.
Is repeating. We're in a loop. It's happening again.
Well, yeah, but like, man, with what you just said on LBJ, like, think about how his idealism, like, he fell short on it in so many ways, right? Like, that's the story about not living up to the ideals,
right?
Like, and the same with Nixon. Hey guys, I got a plan to get us out of Vietnam.
Yeah.
No, you don't, dude. Like, I mean, but he ran on this platform that he was going to end this domestic unrest, and that he had, what was his saying on Vietnam? It wasn't peace without victory, was it?
Oh, it was,
something like that, dude.
Peace with dignity.
Okay.
Peace with dignity, I believe, is what it was. That's what his saying was that.
But think about, I mean, that's a great example on think about how short that guy fell on living up to his highest ideals, right? And maybe too, like I heard somebody the other day arguing that a narcissist was actually historically had been a good leader. Like the leadership guy, I know I had a problem with it, but the leadership characters of a narcissist or people with those personality types actually make, in many cases, for good leaders. But I think maybe that there's a connection with that and what we're saying about, like, okay, how a narcissist is trying to live up to their highest ideals, not Americans' highest ideals.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Like the highest ideals that our Constitution puts forth, right? That are existing within the zeitgeist at the present time in all of the groups.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. This has been super thought provoking, man. Honestly, I really I've had a lot of good ideas since we've been chatting about this.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is good, and I'm just like shocked by, sort of the relevancy of these sort of 68 ideas and how they're back today, and but I say they're back today, but I mean, the truth that we both, I believe, realize is that they never really went away, and that we just kind of have shuffled them into a dustbin or into a filing cabinet, and now they're back, you know. But it's like these are issues that we never really faced, that we never really resolved, and that maybe, and it's I made a sort of a Facebook post about this, but sort of that I feel that as far as sort of like the civil rights movement about equality, about racial equality, is that our generation, you know, unfortunately, we have failed with that. And that our parents' generation, as we see through 68 and all that, they failed at that too. But maybe this current generation, and I mean, maybe you could chalk it up to just some idealistic notion that maybe I have or whatever, but is that maybe they can get it right this time. You know, maybe they can succeed in the ways that we didn't, and that we have to do something now.
You know, and I've heard some people argue that perhaps these generations we're talking about passing away, right, will lead to it. But man, I don't think that that's going to purely do it. I think that'll stomp out some of the narrative and some of the prominence, but you've had that has been propagated within families and cross-generational lines, right, to the point that in, I believe it was 2014, that those three, back to the Emmett Till story on that monument goes up in 08. Sometime in like 2014, three fraternity students from, I believe it was Ole Miss or whatever the nearby colleges, or one of the bigger Mississippi institutions, put an Instagram photo up of them with their guns standing in front of the sign after they had shot it. And it's like, so it's not just like, it's not just that generation's got to, right, you know, so that, but some people have made some points, and I even kind of mentioned that earlier in this talk, is that perhaps we're a couple of generations away from seeing more improvements. But are we ever going to reach that proverbial promised land as a society that MLK is talking about?
Right. Yeah.
You
I
know,
mean, that's, like I said, as an idealist, you want to believe that that's possible, you know, that you can get there. But what's important is that you try, that, you know, you put forth the effort in order to right the wrongs of the past. And, you know, you talk about how it's sort of ingrained or institutionalized into people's ideas, or in people's thought processes, these ideas, these unfortunately, or we can call them habits, I guess, that are sort of transferred from generation to generation or whatnot. And, you know, I mean, it raises the interesting question. I mean, I know you were texting me, I think yesterday, about it, but like, how long is it before the lost cause myth is stamped out? You know, because that's been going on for what, like 130 years? 140 years?
Yeah. And I've just been discovering so much disparaging stuff about that, man, about like how many people I know that buy into it. And then too, on the did you see that video I shared about the Confederate Daughters group, right? About how they're the money behind the monuments, and they're all facing north towards the aggressor.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
An interesting thing about the protests and the sort of resurgence and hey, we should focus on racial inequality, is that I see sort of the idea to remove the Confederate monuments now coming back into vogue, you know, or move them from places where, you know, they're out, like, hey, they're in front of the courthouse or whatever, which a good example of that is Dardanelle. You ride right across the bridge and there's the Confederate soldier, you know, just waiting there sort of to say, hey, whites only, you know, that sort of thing, which it's
I just see what the was it the Navy or Marine Corps one? It's came out of the Pentagon yesterday. Hausnick shared it. Was the display of the Confederate flag in public spaces by members of that branch rather has been prohibited. So, but we've moved forward a couple of times. But people, I don't think some people just don't get it. And
no, they don't. Yeah,
Well,
well,
okay, so you were sharing about the Peach Festival a couple of days ago, right? It was this festival from our hometown, right? And it's
it's
super
always
hot.
humid. It's always
Oh,
like heat index 120 degrees or whatever, and it's like you can feel your skin like boiling. That's what.
dude, so let me tell you, and I'll just cop to this, man. I don't care. I was a child. I lived on Central Street down by the levee, so I was in walking
Uh-huh.
distance to the Peach Fest. I'm talking like 150 yards from the courthouse square. So I would walk down there, and dude, I'm talking like I'm 8, 10 years old, and I'm like, oh, I'm gonna get this rebel flag wallet with the chain. Oh, oh, you remember those hats that were like tall? Like they're
Yeah,
like a tall hat, but like this. Got one of those with the rebel flag because I had no clue. I was like,
I know,
that's a
man.
cool. It's like an X, and I'm like, the British flag's cool too. Like that's
Yeah,
how my mind as a kid is thinking. And like now, I'm just like, I feel super stupid
yeah, like
about that.
right. I know.
But it was just like that stuff was sold. What the point I wanted to make is that stuff was sold widely to children on our courthouse square.
Yeah, yeah, it was. Right.
I even had a ring with the rebel flag on it. Okay, I think I got it all the same day. But I mean, I'm talking like I'm an 8-year-old kid. I know no better, and it's not being told to me like, hey, maybe imagine people that were probably there that saw like me walking around with my rebel flag shit being like, what a racist little boy. I don't know. Like, I mean, were there people like me and you now that are there seeing that go on being like, I can't I
Yeah.
can't believe this is still happening.
Right. Right. No, yeah, I mean it's you're right. It's crazy, man. I don't know, it's sort of like, yeah, you have this romanticization of sort of right the Confederacy, and I mean that's all through this region sort of thing, but it's like, yeah, where it's like it's almost this idea that like, well, the Civil War ended, everybody shook hands, and everything was fine after that. It's sort of right, and we know. I mean, as students of history, we know that's not true. You still have the Reconstruction period, and then you have the segregation thing coming to try to reestablish white supremacy in the South, and the horrors from that, and lynchings are still going on, and right, it's the racial inequality problem, the civil rights movement. All these are all historical problems that we're being faced with today because we haven't faced the truth. We can't. We don't want to face the truth. Maybe I don't know. There are people out there who don't. But
Yeah, it's not easy. I know people
oh no, right.
they just don't want to because it's not comfortable and they don't want to feel the discomfort of knowing. Like I challenged somebody on that the other day and they're
Mm,
like, no, I don't want to hear that. That's going to break my heart. And I'm like, I don't care. Like,
right.
yeah, I was like, that's part of the problem, that you're not willing to learn what these people are talking about because it's uncomfortable for you. Right.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
and man, like I said, I've gotten goosebumps multiple times since we've been talking. I've cried in the last 24 hours because of an image or a video I've seen that is us falling massively short on our highest ideals and on
Right.
human rights and on racial equality. And if you dig through our history, you can definitely see the linkages. Like, yeah, we're trying to analyze what's going on right now, looking back, but it's like those people that don't know where they came from, they could never see the connections.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. It's true. But man, it's just such weird times now, man. But it's weird to think like that like how much progress that the civil rights movement made in the 50s and in the 60s, and how it just sort of stops. And that, but it's almost like this belief that people think that, oh, it ended, everything was fine. But obviously, everything's not fine. I mean, if you look into the history of it, it's not fine. If you look into what's happening today, it's not fine. But it's amazing to think that like in 68, like 10 years previous to that a Black American could not sit and have a cup of coffee or a sandwich at the same lunch counter as a white person. I mean, that's incredible, right?
And going back through all these eyes on the prize. I didn't. I mean, you know that there's segregation, but like the number of instances that it was occurring, I just wasn't like. I mean, up on it. I guess like of thinking I'm like, but busing short, short or long distance, businesses, lunch counters, movie theaters,
Yeah, department stores. Right. Yeah.
water fountains. Like this was on one of the first 2 or 3 eyes on the prize, but one of the guys being interviewed was like talking about the 2 water fountain situation, and he was like, I'm like a little boy, so I'm like, of course, there's this nice marble water fountain. It's very beautiful. And there's this crappy one. I drank out of both, and I was like, Mama, they're both the same. These are the same water fountains. The water tastes the same. Why can't I drink out of both of them? Or that one? That one looks better. And she's just like trying to quell it, like, hey, we'll talk about this later. We need to get out of here in case anybody saw that.
Right.
Like, but just a number, like the courthouse thing. I wonder how, what churches, obviously too, there's black churches, but I wonder how much of that was going on, where it was just like, there are no African Americans allowed at this church. I mean, I'm sure that went on.
Right. Yeah. But it's amazing to think like the links, the things that were accomplished in that short period of time. And we'll call it the classic civil rights movement. That's kind of what it's referred to as, that period from sort of Brown first Board of Education in 54 to, like the murder of Dr. King in 68. In that.
So I wonder just as a historian, like I wonder where the Black Lives Matter movement is going to fit into the overall narrative, because this has become a big enough thing over the last few years that it's like, okay, well, that gives us a workable bookend for now to work backwards from, to let's say like 87 when I was born, or mid 80s, where the dialogue really has died off substantially by that time, right? And has stayed quiet throughout most of my life. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's what's kind of the maybe different from now in 68 is that, you have these gains, you have all this stuff that is going on in sort of this decade plus, almost 15 years or whatever leading up to 68. But if you go from like the murder of Dr. King, or we'll say maybe even the early 70s up until today, you just have flare-ups. You have these just moments where it kind of just comes in waves and it goes away. And hopefully this wave keeps going. Hopefully it hasn't crested at this point and everybody just goes back to sleep again, because this is an issue that we have to deal with, that we as historians, that we deal with every day when we read this stuff, but that the public has to deal with it. And I mean, obviously there was a lot going on in 68. There's a lot going on today, but that it's important that the ideals of the civil rights movement, which I think are all fundamentally human ideas that we all should share and have, and that those things should be, they should come to be. Like we need to make it so. We need to have these things now, because that didn't happen at this time.
Because, well, I mean, that question I mentioned being posed earlier by RFK, it's like we are still asking it, whether or not all Americans should enjoy what most Americans enjoy. I say most.
Right. Are we truly, and this is a question we're asking ourselves in the 60s, and we're asking ourselves before that, are we the beacons of the free world? Are we the archetype of what liberty and freedom is supposed to be? Because if you think, and this is a tool that like communists attempted to use against in the 50s and 60s, is, hey, they're supposed to be the champions of the free world, and yet you have all this segregation where you can't have Black Americans participating in the same sort of daily chores, daily activities as white people. And we're still asking ourselves those questions today. Are we really making America great again? Does it? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point, man. It really is, because it's just very much a case of, in many ways, history repeating itself as we keep hammering on. But that is, yeah, I don't know if you saw an image. I shared this on the podcast page, but when I think it was the first or second night of the riots in Minneapolis, you have power lines on fire, and this guy flying this American flag, and it's like blowing, but he's walking through the streets of Minneapolis, and he's a protester, and it's crazy stuff going on. But I shared that, and I said, "Greatest country on earth." And because it's like, the way that we are appearing now on a world stage is not too much different than what you were referencing a moment ago. It's how the rest of the world views us in comparison to our ideals, and how we're falling short on them. And I mean, these protests are not just a United States phenomenon. There's George Floyd protests happening in other countries too.
Yeah, right. That's important too, right? Is that after the death of Dr. King, is that, there were protests across the globe whenever he died. And that, so it's, and I mean, that is what's happening today. But it shows that, it's not just, I mean, it is a national problem, but it's more than that. It's a global problem. It's a human problem, and it's something that we need to reckon with. We have to, or we're just going to keep going through the motions. This is going to just keep happening again and again and again, and it has to be dealt with at some point. But I just think that it doesn't. These ideas don't have to be a casualty again. I mean, they weren't killed, but they were seriously damaged. But it's like, it doesn't have to be. We don't need to do any more damage than we've already done.
Yeah, this is a great time to learn, and this will be a great podcast for people to listen to right now. I've been telling everybody, it's like, talk to your friends, family, and neighbors, educate, have open dialogue, try not to get emotional.
Right.
This is the time for open dialogue. And I think that, too, and something I've been conflicted with too about open dialogue, and is like, I have had a super ardent stance on people arguing against things we're talking about, right? Like, I've sadly removed a ton of people from my Facebook that have chimed in with, and I didn't really like, there are a few examples I just couldn't live with. I'm like, you're racist.
I know. Yeah, I've run into it too, and it's
and then there's, it's just, so am I doing a positive thing by removing them, or should I keep them around to hear my narrative? You know what I'm saying? Or it's not my narrative, it's our narrative, the narrative of America. But it's, that's the thing. It's like, are these people, I'm better served by not having to stand shoulder to shoulder with a racist on any issues, but are they better served? What is going to bridge the gap on changing those types of ideologies?
Right. I think it's an important question. And I think that's one that, it doesn't have a necessarily clear-cut answer to it, right? Is that you want to sort of live by example and say, hey, well, maybe, if I conduct myself in a certain fashion, that, maybe that the ideas I have will transfer, and be like, okay, well, hey, maybe they are reasonable, and their way of thinking is, maybe my way of thinking is not the correct way of thinking, or, like that. But it is hard. And because it's emotionally draining. It really is. It is hard to remove your emotions from something like this, because it is such a human issue, and I know this is a subject that is very important to the both of us. This idea about racial inequality, and about people's rights, and that sort of idea and narrative and all that. And it is very hard to remove your emotions from it. And I don't even know if that is really possible, with something that is as deeply affecting as sort of what is happening now. I mean, I don't, I mean, but that's a problem with history to begin with. I mean, can you really remove your biases and that sort of thing? That's just, I think, something that we deal with on a daily basis. Probably normal people don't deal with that, That's sort of.
Let me ask you this: have you lost sleep any nights over all this stuff going on?
Yeah.
Dude, I did last night. Part of it was my dogs needing out at 1:30 for some reason, but I was tossing and turning before that and after. And there's been about 3 nights where I'd just taken in so much that day that it's like the protests were happening in my dreams, man.
Right. Well, I mean, to me, it's deeply affecting, not only because of my own beliefs about we should treat each other equally, and that we need to, like I say, fulfill the promises of the civil rights movements of the 60s and all that. But it's like, I mean, I have a 6-month-old daughter now, and that, you want your kids to grow up in a world that's better than the world you had before it, right? And that you don't want them to experience or see any of these forms of discrimination or of inequality, or you want some form of stability, some form of humanity, that you don't want this chaos. You don't want this and these ideas. You don't want them to be exposed to racism or discrimination. Right, you don't want them to experience that or know people who experience that, because that, I mean, it affects everybody.
Yeah. Did you listen to that Ashton Kutcher speech the other day? I know it's kind of worthy listen. I mean, he basically just gave a super impassioned speech, but in the speech he used this example. He has a son and a daughter, right? And he lets his daughter go first all the time before his son, right? And one time, as like little boys will do, he threw a fit about it. He's like, "Why does she always get to go first? Why don't I ever get to go first?" And he goes, "We've decided to go second because in some places women don't get to go at all." Right. Yes. Yeah, like that is such a great, and those are the types of things. And I know it's crazy. Your daughter's 6 months old already, but I know that we've even before she was born, I was like, bro, you got to tell me. Like Cora and I are trying right now, and it's like these are the things I very much so think about, and it's been a struggle for me, particularly lately, because like we're trying right now, be like, oh yeah. What a great world to bring in. I know. I mean, it's rough, but it's like, but it will be one of my joys to share these ideas with my child. Right. And it's and I love sharing martial arts with kids. I mean, obviously I own a martial arts school and have a lot of over 100 kids that train there, but it's something different about sharing those techniques with them and sharing like the stuff we're talking about, the history, the ideas, the, human rights, how we could just do better and how we've fallen short, and trying not to get super negative with that. I mean, it's like how Ashton Kutcher's put that. It's not a super negative way to say that to your little boy. But to let him know that, like, but then too, like I was a grown adult man before I realized how much women had been systemically disenfranchised over time. Right. True. Yeah, I agree. Right. Yeah. And it's the same sort of instance. I learned a lot of history and was blown away, and then almost still couldn't accept some things. Right. Mm-hmm. It was weird. It took me a while to really gain any empathy on that, and I've struggled with that. Not struggled with having it now, but it's like, why? How could I not see this before? That sometime we decided to suppress the whole consciousness of women, like whereas we used to deify them in the ancient world with goddesses. Venus figurines. Right. I think maybe on a future 68 podcast, I think, because I know we've focused on civil rights thing now with sort of Black Americans and that maybe we should probably have a few minutes on women's
rights and on
for sure.
on Native American rights and the gay rights thing, because I mean that is I know we've talked about the civil rights and African Americans and all that, but it's like there are so many groups that are unfortunately sort of marginalized, right? When it's like sort of previous to this point, they're gaining momentum, things are changing, but it's like sort of 68 kind of puts the boot down, on like I said, the idealism and I think one of the central questions that we've tried to kind of answer here, or maybe add to, is 68 really the year the dream died? The dream of the 60s, the ideal of the 60s. But I don't know if it's as much as if it died or it was just sort of locked away and forgotten.
Well, think about, like you kind of made a reference. So we had on this a little bit earlier. Maybe it's like so this metaphorical dream, the American dream, right? Like, what if that is like, hey man, I have a dream to own a martial arts school, and over a period of years, I was able to actualize that dream. Like, I own the second largest martial arts school in the state now because I had this dream. Like, in that sense, but maybe like another metaphor for the dream would be that it has not been actualized because we're sleeping on the dream, right? Just like in action. Like, if I wouldn't have had all of this action, I wouldn't have achieved my personal dream of whatever, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's two. It's like this sort of conceptual take on it, and it's like, well, maybe our dream is just it hasn't awoken from its slumber, so to speak. But talking about a dream and the sense of something you achieved, not like a different state of consciousness.
Right. Yeah. Right. But
yeah. Well, right on, man. I think it's been a super productive talk, man. We should definitely do it again. It's been our first distance podcast, so I think it worked out pretty well in that regard. So anytime you want to get back together, man, and I've been working in the new studio, and I told you I got my mixer ordered, and I got another whiskey barrel. I got the one with the opening door, and it's got 2 Lazy Susans and a light. I'm going to put some audio in there. It's gonna
cool.
But that's going to be like, I got the whiskey barrel on the tables. Like, I want to film some episodes right there on that table. So it's going to be, it's going to be good.
Yeah. Sounds awesome. Sounds great. Yeah. I mean, like we could do another, right. I mean, we can do a whole series of 68 episodes, of course, continuing.
Well, now we know that we can, even if, because like our state still hasn't given us a date on phase 2. So, and since everybody's protesting and spreading the coronavirus around, but we can do some more of these, man. I'm down. I've been podcasting every single day, essentially. So, and I've been overloading my audience with way too many martial arts themed episodes. Because like I was recording lectures. I started a YouTube for my teaching also. During the shutdown, but I'm just like, I want to get back to, like, I've recorded a whole bunch of martial arts episodes, and when the gym was shut down, I was trying to do that to give my audience, like, were gym members, like, hey, don't cancel your membership. I'm talking to this cool guy from California, see? Because we were shut down from March 16th until May 4th.
Right.
So, but man, I got some good episodes coming up this week. I got a stand-up comic. I've got another historian who's a PhD candidate with Jeff Woods' dad, Dr. Randall Woods, who she went to grad school with me, but she's going to U of A now. So she's coming on to talk a little bit about current stuff that's happening.
Yeah. Well, that's cool.
Yeah. So getting back on track with some more diverse episodes. But you want to do anything, man, you let me know. We'll plan it. I'm down to do anytime you want, as you know.
Yeah. No, it sounds good. I kind of want to go with this. Maybe next episode we should focus on counterculture. Maybe that's how we can get. Maybe that's how we can get Woods in on it.
I will talk to him about that. He's coming on, I think, Thursday at 1:30, 1:00 is when we're going to do ours. So I'll talk to him. I'll see him Monday. So I'll talk to him Monday and see brainstorm, see what he's got in mind.
Yeah, and you've been working on any other history projects or anything, or just?
Man, I interviewed Neil Harrington. I'm writing an article for the encyclopedia, but they've been shut down. So like, I haven't been working on a whole lot because they're not communicating with me about anything. So I had a contact there right before the shutdown, told him I wanted to write the article, did the interview, transcribed it, kind of roughed it out, but I haven't done anything with it. But that's where I feel like on the other side of getting my studio done, getting all moved in there, going to be doing some more projects, probably going to try and reach out to him again, because I want to start with that. I want to write some articles. Eventually I'm going to rehash my thesis. That's not super near on the horizon, but that, and then too, so check this out. I'm going to start doing these tiny desk concerts. It's a new studio, right?
Yeah.
So Black Sabbatical's coming on in like a month.
Cool.
And they're gonna play like a 10-song set. I'm gonna sit down and do like an interview with all of them at the table, and then they're gonna play like 10 songs, and we're gonna record that too. So that'll be super neat.
That's awesome. That's great.
But that's like an all history professor plus an art and behavioral sciences guy.
Yeah.
I guess there's 2 history professors, but good people.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Didn't you say you had was it Mikna or Mishnah?
Mikna.
Did you had him in class? What all does he teach?
The class I had him for was a graduate course, of course, and it was early colonial America. That's sort of his area of focus, is that, and it was a great class. I mean, like, it was a readings course, and yeah, we read a lot of great material in there. But yeah, early American history.
Yeah, like early Republic, Jeffersonian era and stuff like that too.
Well, I think it's actually further back than that, more like the period, sort of.
Yeah. Oh, so straight up colonial. Yeah. So no early Republic. Yeah, it'd be.
Well, I mean, there might be some in there, but we mainly focused on sort of pre-American Revolution, sort of.
Dude, that's always a super taxing time period for me personally. Did you feel that?
Yeah.
Man, because I always show the Crucible, and I have them write a paper. Yeah. A lot of semesters I do, like every other semester. But man, that movie is such a good representation, I feel like, of the shit that I read and hear about.
Yeah.
I've got a book on colonial America. I can't remember what the name of it is that was recommended to me that I'm going to read, but it is it's an interesting time. I'm always happy to get through it and get to the revolution for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, right on, man. Well, just shoot me a text or a message and let me know. Let's start planning that next episode, man. We can set a date, or we can wait till I talk with Wood, see if he wants to come in, and let's start planning that counterculture episode. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, it sounds good. And I'll talk to Julie. We've started sort of planning the Arkansas Unraveled stuff, so we'll be headed your way with.
Oh, and we got the Neil Harrington print all done. So
that's gonna be great. COVID kind of got in the way of a lot of stuff, so that's, but I know that affected everybody, but hopefully there's some light at the end of this tunnel. So
yes, yeah, and that, well, man, if nothing else, oh hey Thurman, can't get together on Saturday, or you can't come from Paris or whatever. Oh, would you like to do this Zoom podcast?
Yeah,
the miracle. Never thought of
the miracle of modern technology. That's right.
Yeah. Well, right on, dude. Well, thanks for coming on, man. I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
All right.
See you.
See you, pal.